Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. We're continuing with my exposition, my translation of Genesis. We have come to chapter 38, in the case of Judah. I'll read verses 1 through 5 to begin. It happened about that time that Judah went down from his brothers and went to stay with a man of Adullam, whose name was Hira. And Judah saw there a daughter of a Canaanite named Shua, and he took her and went into her, and she conceived and bore a son, and his father called his name She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. She bore yet again another son, and she called his name Shelah. And Judah was at Chezib when she bore him. Nothing to comment there. I'll now read verses 6 through 11. Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of Jehovah, so Jehovah killed him. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and marry her and produce offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. And it happened that whenever he went into his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. Now what he did was wicked in the sight of Jehovah, so he killed him also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he said, "Lest he also die like his brothers." So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. A couple things here. Jehovah killed That statement makes clear that Jehovah pays attention to what happens down here. And furthermore, he is prepared to intervene in human affairs. However, must have been unusually bad, because there's just all sorts of bad people in the world. But we are not told what he did. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 7 through 10, the punishment for refusing to produce offspring for a brother who died childless was simply public humiliation, not death. And that was under the severity of the Mosaic law. And this was before Moses, of course. Genesis 9, verse 6 states the crime that it called for death penalty. That was the only one there was at this time, after the flood, between the flood and the law. It was precisely murder. Now, Judah somehow seemed to think that Tamar was responsible for the death of his two sons in some way. Did he think she was a witch or something? I don't know. He didn't want to lose the third son. Okay, let's go on and read verses 12 through 23. This is a long one. After a long time, the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. When Judah was comforted, he went to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And Tamar was told, "Look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil, and disguised herself. As she sat at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. And Judah saw her and thought she was a prostitute because she had covered her face. And he turned aside to her by the way and said, "Come now, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me so that you may come into me?" And he said, "I will send a young goat from the flock." So she said, "Will you give me a pledge until you send it?" And he said, "Oh, what pledge shall I give you?" And she said, "Your signet with its cord and your staff in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she got up and took off the veil from her face, resumed her widow's clothes. And Judah sent the young goat by the hand of his friend, the Adullamite, to receive the pledge from the woman's hand. But he could not find her. So he asked the men of that place, saying, "Where is the prostitute who was at the entrance of Enaim by the way?" And they said, "Well, there was no prostitute here." Then he returned to Judah and said, "I did not find her. And also the men of that place said there was no prostitute here." Then Judah said, "Let her have the pledge, that we not be put to shame. I did send the young goat, but you did not find her." Just a couple things. Just by the way, obviously this was and Onan were grown men and so on, so this is a long time that passed. And even after that, Judah's wife died. And the fact that he was now without a wife helps us understand what he did next. He was alone and so on. Now, verse 13. There always people want to mix in other people's affairs. That must have been done on purpose, by someone who knew the family. That someone said, "Hey, he's going to Timnah." Now, verse 14. According to the culture at that time, what she felt was a legitimate hope on her part. And just by the way, Judah recognized that in verse 26 later on down. Okay, the rest of it is fairly clear. We don't have to comment on it. Let's go on now and read verses 24 through 30, which will finish chapter 38. About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has committed adultery, and she is pregnant through prostitution." So Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, saying, "I am pregnant by the man to whom these things belong." And she said, "Please determine whose these things are, this signet with its cord and this staff." Judah acknowledged them and said, "She is more righteous than I, because I did not give her to Shelah my son." And he never knew her again. And it came to pass at the time of her giving birth that twins were in her womb. And as she was giving birth, one put out his hand, and the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." But then he drew back his hand, and it was his brother who came out. So she said, "How did you force your way out?" Therefore his name was called Perez. Then his brother came out, who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and his name was called Zerah. Dear me. Going back to verse 24, Judah says, "Let her be burned." Now that was sort of cruel, wasn't it? Come on. But of course she was not killed, because when she identified Judah as the father, he acknowledged the fact. That was nasty, right? Now, Perez means breakthrough. Excuse me. By the way, it was through Perez that the Messiah came. Matthew 1:3. Tamar is one of 4 women included in Christ's genealogy as given by Matthew, and all 4 represented some sort of violation, perhaps to emphasize the grace of God. Just by the way, he is always recycling. He's always recycling. Zerah, the name means scarlet. Now we come to the story of Joseph in Egypt. Excuse me a minute. My voice is being bothersome. Okay, I'll now read chapter 39, verses 1 through 6. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. And Jehovah was with Joseph and made him a successful man. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. And his master saw that Jehovah was with him, and that Jehovah made all that he did prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his eyes and served him, and he made him overseer of his house, and put into his hand all that he had. And it came to pass, from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that Jehovah blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of Jehovah was on all that he had in the house and in the field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's hand and knew nothing of what he had except for the bread that he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in body and appearance. A couple things here only. Now, Joseph was bought by Potiphar. It was God's will that Joseph be bought by that man, precisely so that he would end up in the right prison. Potiphar was in charge of a particular prison that held the king's enemies, not an ordinary prison. That was where Joseph had to wind up. Now then, the text here says that Jehovah saw Potiphar, but what could Potiphar have known about Jehovah? How did he know that it was Jehovah who was blessing Joseph? I take it that he sensed that some supernatural power was with Joseph, and Moses, writing centuries later, gave that power his proper name. It was Moses who gave the name. Now, we are not told how much time elapsed between Joseph's arrival and his promotion, but it probably took a year or two at least. That stuff doesn't happen overnight, okay? I'm really curious. The man left everything. He just didn't know anything. Strange, but that's what he was. Now let's read verses 7 through 18. We're still in chapter 39. It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has given all that he has into my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, neither has he kept anything back from me but you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not listen to her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened on a certain day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were there. Inside was there. And she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. So when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her house and said to them, "See, my husband has brought in a Hebrew to mock me. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard that I raised my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside." So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him in the same way, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to mock me. And it happened when I raised my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside." A couple things here. Going back to verse 7, obviously that woman had an easy life with servants to do all the housework. And of course, Joseph was attractive. That's what the text says. So what happened, happened. All right. Notice, however, Joseph's response. He knew that he would not only be sinning against Potiphar, but primarily against God. That was the main thing. Now, she claims that she yelled when she's talking to the men, right? But I ask, how come no one heard that loud cry? It doesn't follow, right? So she said the same thing to Potiphar when he came in the house. So now we go on to what happened next. That's in chapter 39, verses 19 through 23, that will finish chapter 39. So it was when his master heard his wife's word, that when she spoke to him, saying, "Your slave did to me according to these words," that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him in the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And there he stayed. But Jehovah was with Joseph and showed him kindness and gave him favor in the sight of the prison warden. And the warden committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison. Whatever they did there, he was responsible. The warden did not check on anything that was under Joseph's care, because Jehovah was with him and Jehovah prospered whatever he did. Okay. Obviously, God used that bad woman to put Joseph in the right place for the sequence of following events. He had to be in that prison. But of course, she put her husband in a tight spot, okay? He may very well have had his doubts about what really happened, but he had to keep up appearances, right? So, how he sent him, but he must have talked to the warden about Joseph, which is why the warden immediately almost started treating him differently, apparently so. Furthermore, Potiphar probably wasn't the least bit pleased to have lost God's blessing on his house and business. With Joseph gone, God stops blessing him, right? Psalm chapter 76, or Psalm 76, verse 10 says that God uses the wrath of man to his own glory. And that's what happened here. Only in this case, it was a woman. Now we come to chapter 40. I'll read verses 1 through 8. Came to pass after those things that the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was very angry with his two officers, with the chief cupbearer and with the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard, that was Potiphar, put Joseph in charge of the men, and he ministered to them. And they were in custody many days. Then the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream. Both of them. Each man's dream in one night. Each dream having its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, "Oh, why is your face sad today?" And they said, "We each have had a dream, but there is no one to interpret it." And Joseph said to them, "Oh, do not interpretations come from God? And tell me." Obviously, this was God's doing. They both had their dream on the same night. In fact, the dreams themselves. God was setting this up. How did they know there was no one to interpret? Obviously, an interpreter wouldn't be in that prison, right? Now, in verse 8, evidently, Joseph expected God to give him the interpretation. He wasn't claiming to be God himself. Had God prepared him in some way? I don't know. Anyway, he asked to be told. All right, now let's read verses 9 through 15. Then the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. When it budded, its blossoms came out, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches represent 3 days. In 3 days' time, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will give Pharaoh's cup into his hand according to the former custom when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it goes well with you, and please show me kindness and make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve to be put in this dungeon." For the moment, obviously, God gave Joseph the interpretation immediately. And of course, even though God used Joseph in the prison and so on, he wanted to get out. I would too, okay? Perfectly natural. So he asks the cupbearer to remember him. All right, now let's go to the other one, the baker. This will finish this video. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, "I also dreamed, and there were 3 white baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked food for Pharaoh, and the birds ate it from the basket on my head." So Joseph answered and said, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets represent 3 days. In 3 days' time, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh from you." Wow. So it happened on the 3rd day, Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker, in the midst of his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his office as cupbearer, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. However, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. There's two things here. Like Joseph did not do anything to soften the message. He told it straight and hard. You're going to be hanged and the birds are going to eat you. Now, of course, the chief cupbearer forgot all about it. That was perfectly typical about normal human nature without God. But of course, God was behind that too, as we will see. But for now, that's it. Thanks for watching, and God bless.